I'm Kasparian, and welcome to another mouth-watering edition of The Point. We all fantasize about it, or at least think about it multiple times a day. It distracts us from our usual routine, and it takes a considerable amount of effort and planning to get it just right. But when we do manage to get it just the way we want it, it can make us salivate with excitement. But sometimes we don't always get what we're expecting. There's something fishy with that sushi you're eating. There might be horse meat in your Swedish balls, and we're probably hours away from discovering a new E. coli outbreak in our produce. This episode is all about food, and we're going to talk about everything from mislabeling food, food stamps, and the emergence of stupid food stunts. But before we get down to the nitty-gritty, let's meet our panelists. We have Desi Doyen. She is the co-host of Green News Report at bradblog.com and a regular fill-in host here at the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me.
Willy Blackmore is a food editor for TakePart.com. He has written for The Owl, LA Weekly, the Los Angeles Magazine, but this is his first appearance on The Point. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
And James Poulos is a producer at Huffpost Live, a Forbes contributor, and a columnist for Vice. Thanks for joining us, James.
Hey, Anna.
All right, let's get right to it. Our first segment has to do with a story that's really been getting a lot of attention recently, and it has to do with the mislabeling of our food. Now, the recent news story has to do with Oceania discovering that we're mislabeling our fish. In fact, we put together a video kind of summarizing some of the big food controversies that have come up as of late. Let's take a look.
A batch of meatballs pulled from shelves at IKEA stores after check inspectors discovered they contained horse meat had been on sale in several European countries, the company's Czech spokesman said on Monday. A horse meat scandal in Europe has prompted widespread product withdrawals, consumer concern, and government investigations into food processing systems across the continent.
The conservation group Oceania reports as much as 1/3 of all the seafood in the U.S. is mislabeled, according to FDA guidelines. DNA testing of seafood samples collected from more than 600 restaurants and supermarkets in 21 states showed that cheaper, less desirable types of fish are often passed off as the more expensive types like grouper, cod, and snapper fish. The study, for example, identified several fish, including king mackerel and tilefish, which were sold to consumers who believed they were getting red snapper and halibut. Both tilefish and king mackerel contain mercury levels so high the FDA advises pregnant women and children not to eat them.
Now to the government shutdown of the biggest organic peanut butter plant in the country. It's the same company that made peanut butter that already sickened people in 20 states this year.
FDA inspectors describe a horror show of a peanut butter plant in New Mexico, a facility with a history of trouble. This morning now shut down after a widespread salmonella outbreak that sickened 41 people in 20 states.
However, Burger King has dropped some burgers from an Irish firm that they source food from because it's linked to horse meat.
What's that, Wilbur?
Ouch! A total of 27 burger products were analyzed. 10 of them contain traces of horse DNA.
Now, the biggest news story regarding the horse meat has to do with IKEA. It turns out that their meatballs in some countries contained horse meat. Now, the United States and Canada allegedly do not have a problem with this. This is mostly Eastern European countries and some European countries. So, Desi, I want to start with you. Do we really care about what's going on with our food? Like, why is it that every year there seems to be a big news story, but every year we're totally okay with cutting funding for the FDA?
Well, that's a whole mouthful right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we do actually care what's in our food, and when consumers are informed about what's in their food, then they can actually make better choices. So, you know, there's a couple of issues at work here. One of them is the globalization of the food supply chain and applying industrial tactics to it. You know, so what we have with this long global supply chain that was really exposed with the IKEA meatball and the horse meat scandal overall, but specifically with IKEA meatballs. You know, here's IKEA trying to put the global supply chain of, you know, the lowest cost they can possibly get from any supplier around the world. You know, they're trying to apply what they do to furniture to food, you know, and, you know, meatballs are not food. And we do find that when you have this long global supply chain that keeps getting longer and longer and longer, with stores on the one end trying to drive down prices, manufacturers on the other end with their costs going up because of high fossil fuel costs, high feed prices, you know, somewhere in there, there's going to be something that's going to break in that food supply chain where the integrity is going to break down.
So, Willy, why is this happening? Like, obviously, as Desi pointed out, it has a lot to do with cutting costs, but at the same time, you know, do you feel that these suppliers suppliers are purposely using horse meat as a filler? Is horse meat cheaper than eating beef? I mean, what's really going on behind the scenes?
I mean, it seems that so far they've really had a difficult time determining how exactly the horse meat got into the supply chain, and no one has really wanted to own up to it. You know, when this was bouncing around a couple weeks ago, and it was an issue between a place that made burgers in Ireland, and when Burger King got into trouble because they had horse meat in their burgers in the UK, not in the United States, you know, they bounced it back to somewhere in Eastern Europe. I believe it was in Poland, and then the Poles were like, no, we tested, we don't have any horse meat in the product here. So it's very difficult to determine where it's coming from and how it kind of entered the system. And I think that just kind of speaks to the larger point that you were making, that it's amazing that an animal that, if you're looking at it in a field, is so totally different than a cow. A horse is not a cow is not a horse. They just totally, the supply lines can cross that easily, and that no one can determine where it happened. So it's, is it filler, is it cheaper? That may be where, you know, the thinking was at some point along the line, but where that point happened is really difficult to determine, and I think that's kind of the larger issue at hand.
You know, there are definitely some European countries where eating horse is not like this heinous, crazy thing. It is culturally acceptable, so it is there is a possibility that some of these suppliers might have handled beef in an area where they've also handled horse meat, and, you know, horse DNA turned up in these meat samples. But James, what are your thoughts on this, especially the FDA angle of it? Because, you know, when it comes to the food here in the United States, a lot of times the FDA allows the food industry to self-regulate. Does that make sense?
Well, we should be honest that, you know, by and large, these large food systems that generate so much fast food that people eat so often do a pretty good job of keeping contaminants out of the food. People aren't dropping like flies every time they go to Burger King or McDonald's, so credit where it's due. However, when you have a system this large, and you see this whether it's big food or big business or big government, even if the system's really good at producing the desired result most of the time, when there's an undesirable result, it can really be catastrophic. And so I would approach the question from that angle and suggest that, you know, when we trust in the system that much, whatever the system might be, it really does impact our ability to choose to bear the amount of risk that we want to, and it impacts our ability to actually be prudential and form our own judgments about how much risk we want to take on.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, you bring up an interesting point about how we consume so much food, and stories like this seem like they're relatively rare, but my perspective is every year, or at least every few months, you get a news story about something that is contaminated with E. coli or salmonella. Now, a recent incident occurred with the peanut butter that Trader Joe's was selling. And it's kind of incredible with that story because the FDA went into the processing plant to figure out, you know, what's going on. Are they following the rules? And they found out that there were some serious issues. For instance, they didn't even have a sink nearby so they can wash their hands as they're handling the peanuts. In fact, the peanuts were out in the open, and they had access to, you know, environmental conditions which actually allowed the salmonella to grow, for the bacteria and the contaminants to grow and exist. So it's a real problem, and it's amazing that no one did anything about it. The FDA didn't do anything about it. The CDC didn't do anything about it until they found out that people were sick. So I'm kind of wondering whether or not we can really trust the food that we're eating, and if we need to maybe put more funding and more emphasis on a government agency to make sure the food we're eating is safe.
Well, that would be where I would, that would be the side that I would fall on, in that, you know, I know that there are a lot of people who say you shouldn't have more government regulation, but unfortunately, you know, we're not talking about just massive scattershot government regulation. We're talking about, you know, targeted, specific, scientifically based government regulation, and especially enforcement. You know, when we have massive budget cuts and calls for massive budget cuts on the one hand, you know, what happens is that comes out of the personnel. We have fewer inspectors who are spread thin over a greater number of manufacturers, and they just cannot keep up with it. You know, when you talk about the, you know, say the incidence of pathogens getting into, say, chicken, you know, when you have the industry lobbying to speed up their supply lines, their conveyor belts, you know, there's really no way that an inspector can keep up with that. You know, so I think we're introducing opportunities for pathogens to get into the food supply when we cut enforcement and regulation. And, you know, we already know that self-regulation, voluntary self-regulation by the industry just does not cut it. I mean, before this peanut butter issue, there was the one back in 2009 where 7 or 9 people died. And they have now indicted the peanut company executives, and they are possibly going to go to jail. You know, because people died from this. People can die from this. This is all very important.
Absolutely. Now, just going back to the whole horse meat scandal, should this really be a scandal? I mean, Willie, how would you compare this to the whole pink slime scandal that happened here in the United States? Like, is it as bad? Should people really be that concerned that they're eating horse meat?
No, I mean, inherently there's no problem with eating horse. There's a lot of emotional issues tied up with eating horse. There's certain health concerns related to some antibiotics and other drugs that horses that are kept as companion animals or as work animals or as racing animals that you don't want to eat. One of them, I forget the full name of it, but it's known as bute. And they've been testing it because there is a health concern for human consumption, and it hasn't showed up in any of the horse meat that's been found in Europe. But the point is not about eating horse or not eating horse. Horse is lean. It's actually really healthy from all accounts, and you know, it's not that that would be a problem. It's the fact that if you're going to buy Swedish meatballs and you're buying beef Swedish meatballs, that they should have beef in them. They shouldn't have horse in them. And like, there's been this whole thing in there where there's equine DNA. And that's the kind of thing where, like, if you run beef through a meat grinder that's had horse run through it, yeah, equine DNA gets in the beef. But then there was also, I believe it was the lasagna in England had like close to like 90% horse. That's not
that's not just the DNA.
I didn't clean something. That's I totally blew it
on purpose, adulterating the food supply, substituting something.
And the interesting thing is, you know, France is always the country that we think of as like the French eat horse. You know, my grandfather had a story from World War II that he was stationed there, and they went to some bistro and they had steak, and they were all stoked because they had no food, and they eat the steak and they drink some wine and they find out they were horse steaks and they were mortified. But so the interesting thing is that the French are furious about this, and it doesn't have anything to do with eating horse or not eating horse. And you know, a lot of people that are vegetarian, they're like, well, an animal is an animal, and you kill an animal, you kill an animal. It's the same thing. But it's not about that. It's about
the deception, being misled.
The supply chain.
Absolutely. So, of course, another angle to this story has to do with fish. Oceana just recently did a study. They looked at fish in 21 states, and they specifically looked at retailers and you know, sushi restaurants to see whether or not these retailers are mislabeling their fish. And 1 out of 3 times they discovered, oh my God, the fish is definitely mislabeled. In fact, let's take a quick look at the map, and it gives you specific numbers. In California, it's particularly bad. In one part of California, Southern California, 52% of the fish was mislabeled. In Northern California, it was about 38%. In places like Austin, it was 59%. In Florida, 38%. So you're seeing this all over the country. And you know, one big concern is that white tuna is being mislabeled when it's really escolar. And people are concerned about that because of the fact that, by the way, some countries have banned escolar, and it's known to cause some digestive issues.
Intestinal distress.
Yes, intestinal distress, exactly. So it's another example of deception. But Desi, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, do you feel like people are over-exaggerating the findings of this study, or is this something to really be concerned about?
I think absolutely not. They are over-exaggerating. It is something to be concerned about, because not only are we talking about cheating customers out of their money who think that they're buying, say, wild salmon rather than farmed salmon, but you know, there are also issues, not just like with the bute, the medication that might be found in horse meat that actually causes, you know, human problems for if you consume it. But you know, we have issues with, say, mercury in fish, and sustainability issues. You know, when people are trying to make sure that they buy sustainably harvested fish that have been certified, you know, there's a little card that you can get that tells you, you know, what fish are in trouble and what are sustainable and what have been certified. So first of all, they're being cheated on that aspect as well. But when you talk about mercury in seafood, mercury in fish, that is an issue that, you know, pregnant women and children should not be eating certain types of fish. The FDA tells them flat out, do not eat these. And if they're being substituted, then you have people who are actually, their health is being put at risk, and the health of their children is being put at risk. This actually does matter quite a bit.
Well, that's an important point, because there's another layer here too, and providing information is one cost-effective way that the FDA can play a role here. But when we talk about the corporations trying to speed up the process of delivering food, well, what are they responding to? They're responding to a market demand where people want to speed up the process, where they get the food and eat it and can move on to whatever they're doing with their day. So, you know, no matter how much regulation there is, no matter what's going into the food, the consumer still has to bear at least some responsibility, I think, to slow things down a little bit and consider what it is they're really eating. So, you know, the slow food movement, things like that, development's in a good direction, but as you suggested, you know, even with farmed salmon and other things that, you know, seem natural or seem like they might be a healthier way to go, you've got to do better than just looking at the billboard that says if it's here, it's good for you, and going in and thinking that whatever it is that you eat from that store is going to be good.
Can you explain really quickly for our audience what the slow food movement is? Because that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, and it is. And basically the idea is that if you prepare the food more slowly, then it'll make you present to sort of what's going into the food and what it entails and how things combine. And it's just kind of a slower paced and more considered approach to the process of sort of growing food and eating food and sitting around and talking while you're eating the food. It's that sort of approach.
That's a really interesting approach, but is it realistic in, you know, cities like Los Angeles and New York where people are on the go, 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 and they want the food?
People in LA squander tons of time every day. It's a culture of sitting around after work, you know, maybe a little early, drinking, smoking, relaxing. You can do the same with food.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I disagree with that a little bit. I wish I had some time to sit around, smoke and drink.
Well, I think part of it also you have to figure out where is the breakdown. You know, is it gross negligence? Is it deliberate fraud? You know, and where is it introduced into the system? You know, reading the Oceana study, I didn't get to finish it, but it looked like not all of the places where this fraudulent fish was sold actually realized that they were selling fish that had been mislabeled. So at what point did it come into the system?
That's the interesting thing about fish in particular, that it's the only large food industry and food source that still comes from the wild. You know, we don't go hunt buffalo for meat anymore. We raise them on a ranch. And so when you have stuff that's coming from all around the world, it goes through multiple hands on the way from the boat to wherever you're buying it from. There's so many places along the way where something can get confused or something can get mixed up. And then there's this odd thing too about these place associations that we have with certain fish. And we talk about fisheries and we talk about sustainability, and so we say, well, the cod fishery in New England has problems. And it almost feels like a bulk bin. Like we go to this bulk bin in New England and we pull cod out of it. But there's a lot of other fish that are in the ocean in New England. They're just trying to catch the cod. And so there's this kind of like weird mental state that I think people are in when it's difficult to understand the large global seafood trade. And you just want to have this fish that's this certain thing from this certain place, and you think it's sustainable. Yeah. And when everything is kind of, you know, other fish are coming on the boat when you're pulling cod or Alaskan salmon on the boat, things cross paths on docks, and some of these fish look exactly the same. Yes. And so it's really a much more complicated thing, and since it is so global and since it's a wild source, the kind of standard FDA regulation, government intervention is a little bit stickier.
I'm really glad that you brought that up. That's a really good point. And let me just, you know, close this segment by making a comment about sustainability. You know, obviously, you know, as a liberal, I care about sustainability, I care about the environment, but it's so unbelievably difficult to be an environmentally conscious eater, to be an ethical eater. I mean, something as simple as quinoa, for instance, is unethical because of the fact that, you know, in Ecuador, now they're so focused on selling the quinoa that the people of their own country don't get to eat it. They've inflated prices so much. So it's so difficult to figure out what is and isn't sustainable. It's very difficult to get food right when you want it. You do have to slow down. You do have to think about where you're getting that food from. And every once in a while, I get really tempted in having a conservative approach when it comes to food and just saying, you know what, fuck it all. I'm just gonna eat what I want to eat, and then you guys could figure it out later. Now, of course, I'm not gonna do that. But you know what, stick around, because in our next segment, we're gonna talk about food assistance, food stamps. You know, what's the drama with that? Should we cut funding for it? Does it make sense? Stick around, we'll get into a nice discussion about that and more. Welcome back to The Point. Newark Mayor Cory Booker decided to do something known as the Food Stamp Challenge. Now, there have been a number of politicians that have attempted this, a number of chefs that have attempted this, and basically they want to see if they could live off the amount of money they get for groceries. Now, this is what needy families have to live on, and is it enough? Let's take a look.
I live in a community where over 100,000 of my residents use SNAP, and I see it every day, but I never really stopped to think exactly how much money did they have to spend. And repetitious, because you know if you're buying on a limited budget, you often tend to buy in bulk. So you get the same meals over and over again. And I am definitely not a talented enough cook to create any kind of variety. And so everything I experienced that was difficult, it really hammered home to me that this is the reality for so many Americans. And that just shouldn't be, because we have the power to change this.
Now, I love that we have politicians doing this, because they really put themselves in the position of needy families that depend on, the SNAP program to make ends meet. And, one thing that I want to mention is a few of the statistics. First of all, people who are dependent on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program get about $4 a day to eat. $4 a day. 49% of the participant households have children that are 17 years old or younger, and 55% of those are single-parent households. 15% of all participant households have elderly individuals. These are individuals over the age of 60, and 20% of all participant households have non-elderly disabled members. So these are people who are really, really struggling. And, Willy, I want to start with you, because whenever it comes to issues like this, these social programs, these assistance programs, there's a lot of disagreement in Capitol Hill. And do you think that the majority of individuals understand how meager the food stamp benefits are?
No, I don't think they do, and I think that it's really great that people are doing, it is kind of like a stunty thing to be like, well, I'll do this for a week and, kind of put myself in their shoes, but when it gets to kind of the stature of someone like Cory Booker, who's very, in the spotlight, I think that helps kind of reveal the issue to a greater audience, but I still feel like there's probably a certain amount of disconnect, because it really is such a meager amount of food. And it's not even just the issue of like how much money you have to spend. It's also issues of food access, what's available in the neighborhoods these people are living in, what their work situation is like, if they have a fleet of cars to drive them to the store, or if they're taking public transportation. The amount that Cory Booker can do with $4 a day is probably very different from the amount that someone with $4 a day can do in Compton or somewhere in South LA, or even in parts of Newark. Kind of depending on where you are in the social structure. So I think that it's not something that people really kind of think of all the finer details of, but that it helps to have people kind of pointing these things out.
So James, last year we spent about $75 billion on food assistance, and this is something that Republicans are livid about, and are they justifiably livid about it? Do you feel that we've created a welfare state that allows people to, or it incentivizes people to live their lives this way? Now, I'm obviously playing devil's advocate, but I'm very curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think that when the administration made a splash in the news for actually evangelizing for food stamps and going into neighborhoods and saying, hey, this is available to you and you should consider doing it, don't be ashamed, I think that sort of raised Republican hackles. And the fear there, as always, is that this is yet another program where once people get on it, they're never going to get off. So, that's a concern. I want to go back to what Cory Booker said. I thought it was revealing, and it's true that we can't look at the food stamp situation in isolation. There's a lot going on here. Booker, he remarked that, like, gosh, I can't cook very well, so I'm sort of stuck eating the same thing. That's not very appealing. There is a problem in America where cooking is sort of phasing out, and where going to go get food is phasing in. And let's face it, you go to Jack in the Box. I love Jack in the Box sometimes. You're looking at like $10 for lunch. Yeah. And if you can cough up like $15 for lunch, you can eat at like some of the best, most appealing restaurants in LA. So the food alternative to cooking is more expensive than perhaps people would want it to be. And portion size. Americans like to eat big portions of food. So in a way, we're being acculturated to think that we're not really eating enough unless we have a plate that's full of food. Granted, we don't want people starving, but could I live exclusively on food stamps? I almost do live exclusively on Power Bars and Bushmills, and you don't need the Bushmills to live. So it is doable. Whether or not it befits the dignity of Americans to a level that we want, that's another question we can ask.
Okay, to say that it's doable, I guess it's doable, but it's extremely difficult, especially considering the fact that a lot of these individuals aren't, they're characterized as like these lazy, government money-sucking people, but the reality is a lot of them are like employees at Walmart that are working full-time jobs, but still aren't making enough money to put food on the table. So do these people have the time to sit down and make a meal and nitpick and try to figure out, okay, where can I get the absolute cheapest produce? Or, you know, how can I make sure I can stretch this government dollar as much as possible? I mean, is that a realistic thing to say? And also, another aspect of this that people don't consider, and I think, Willy, you mentioned it a little bit, the food deserts. So a lot of people that are living in these poor areas don't have access to regular grocery stores where they can get a deal on their produce.
Oh yeah, good luck finding a good grocery store with, you know, up-to-date produce in an inner city area. I mean, I've been to those grocery stores, and it's really it's very sad to see the lower quality produce at the very high price that you would not see, say, in Beverly Hills, for example. It might still be high price, but it's also very high quality. So the food dollar that they get for the assistance doesn't really stretch when you have to factor in things like how far do they have to travel to get to a grocery store? How far do they have to travel? How much is their rent? You know, that's taking the money out of the amount of money that they have for their food budget in any given week or month. When you look at the lack of availability of food, and then also the lack of education about how to cook, how to stretch your food dollar, you know, what foods are actually better for you than others. You know, one of the things that came up was New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, you know, wanting to ban sodas. There was also an issue where New York City wanted to take sodas out of the food stamp program. The beverage makers were extremely upset about that and fought very hard to not have that be an issue. Back when there was an issue of not enough calories going into the system back in the 60s, that's why they let soda in. Now we don't have a problem with that. Now we have an obesity problem.
Yeah, that's a very hot topic because people get really angry when anyone mentions the government taking, you know, high-calorie foods out of the SNAP program, specifically sodas. I mean, I don't really understand why you need to drink soda, but at the same time, when it comes to unhealthy food, I mean, when you're living on $4 a day, the cheapest food is the most available to you because with $4 a day, I mean, think about it. You can buy, you can go to the 99-cent store and buy a bunch of snacks and unhealthy food, but can you really make a gourmet meal off of $4 a day?
Well, there's this whole concept in discussing these hunger issues of stuffed and starved, and it's kind of a uniquely American problem, is that we have these food access issues in poorer neighborhoods where the predominant available calorie is, you know, a cheap empty calorie, as they call it. So something like soda or chips or, you know, things from a fast food restaurant, and they have caloric content and they will give you energy to get through the day, and they're cheap, and it's something you can, you know, kind of approach living off of $4 a day on, but they're really bad for you. So then you have a high obesity rate in an area with high food insecurity, and people have a hard time justifying those two issues that, like, well, these people are fat. Why can't, they're clearly getting enough to eat, but they're not getting healthy food. And I think that kind of like the larger debate about hunger, which just involves so many myriad aspects of, you know, our social structures, really, it's really kind of difficult to wrap your head around, and it always kind of feels like this issue of the other, like that it's not me, it's not my neighbors, it's these people, you know, that live in rural America or in poorer neighborhoods, and it's kind of hard to grasp because it's so complicated and it's easy to kind of push off. But I think this stuffed and starved thing is really kind of interesting to consider, that just because you are clearly getting enough caloric intake does not mean you're not wanting for food or for money for food.
I think that's right, and I think it's time to just admit that really with Bloomberg and with others, you know, this is the government getting into the business of basically parenting. I mean, if you live in a time when the vast majority of moms stay at home and control the food supply for their kids, then you don't have to worry about some of the social problems that we're seeing today, whether it's, you know, undernourishment, malnourishment, overnourishment, obesity. And, you know, it can be uncomfortable for some people to say, like, well, you don't need to drink soda, so you're not going to. Well, you don't need to drink kombucha either. You don't need to eat organic rice. So that doesn't mean that those things should be taken away. Really, the honest argument is exactly what a stay-at-home mom would say. I don't want you to eat this, so you're not going to. And when the government ends up taking that position, even if it's sort of well-intentioned and ultimately the right move in terms of people's health, that's going to make people upset.
But wouldn't you argue that if you're living on $4 a day, you're going to use that money to buy the cheapest possible food because you're going to get more bang for your buck. I mean, it kind of gives people an incentive to eat unhealthy foods, doesn't it?
I guess, but a big bag of rice is pretty cheap, and that's not necessarily the worst thing for you to eat,
but
right?
I also think we can't separate out the government subsidies that go to certain crops. You know, the
sure.
government subsidizes corn, soy, and wheat, you know, but they don't subsidize fruits and vegetables and nuts, you know, in the same manner. So we have the issue of being able to afford, you know, getting more bang for your buck. Also being influenced by the manufacturers and the big agriculture lobby that want to make sure that they keep this money flowing to them as well.
The presence of corn in everything in America really is a scandal.
Right, you know, and then when you get into food access issues, there's a great film coming out called A Place at the Table, I think is what it's called, and it's I saw it mentioned on The Daily Show. It apparently looks to be this documentary that really explains and lays out the entire complex system so that everybody can approach and understand, you know, the many different moving parts of this. So
it's actually Take Part's parent company, Participant Media, is putting out the film, and it comes out on March 1st. And it is kind of takes this 360-degree view of the issue, and it gets into these issues of crop subsidies. And it's interesting because, excuse me, SNAP and its predecessors of federal food assistance are part of the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is what regulates agricultural law, and it's where the direct payment system of crop subsidies is set. And then it also has this this food assistant element in it too, and other programs for helping people out in terms of food access are wrapped up in it. And it's something that's been intertwined since the very beginning, since like New Deal era. I think it's 1939. It's like the first time when we had a government subsidized food stamp program, and it was essentially giving people, you bought a food stamp for $1 and then you got 50 cents to buy surplus from farmers. And so these things are very intertwined, and the intentions are really good, is that you kind of give this this safety valve sort of for a very uncertain industry of farming, and then you give the people that are in low income, they can buy these things at a cheap price, and they kind of have this nice overlap. But it's gotten so far removed from that, as you're talking about with corn. And I think it's 10% of farms receive 75% of subsidy payments since 1995. And a lot of times that 10% of farms, what you think of as a farm, is like this family lives in a barn, has their land. They're actually absentee landlords, basically, where they have millions and millions of acres in Iowa and Midwest and elsewhere, where they're raising these crops that have a huge market for them, and then they'd be subsidized at huge levels. And that's what's feeding into this inner city issues, and also in rural America, where everything is high fructose corn syrup, everything is subsidized wheat. And so it's this kind of really horrendous cycle. And so to the parenting issue, it's kind of easy to say that, but I think that there's this public health argument that kind of makes it the responsibility of government to say something about this, because it's, yeah, kombucha is a choice, but this is a larger, kind of more insidious issue because it's so intimately related with how the government is spending subsidy money.
Saying something is one thing, and then banning food products outright is another.
Yeah, but I think that it's easier to say, well, it's your choice to buy these more expensive healthy things, and it's your choice to buy soda. But when you're in an environment where you're a market, essentially, for this cheap product that has this huge industry swirling around it, and then even being on food assistance, being on SNAP, you're kind of tied into that subsidy system, it's a little bit more problematic. And so you can say it's parenting, or you can say that it's kind of trying to break this cycle.
Well, I mean, it's definitely a problem when you can use your EBTs to go down to, you know, KFC or choose your fast food restaurant of choice and walk out with like 5,000 calories of food, right? On the one hand, well, okay, that's a lot of calories, so that's like a good usage of my money. But on the other hand, you know, again, this is like, fast food is not necessarily the cheapest way to eat. And when the government is complicit in sort of working together with fast food companies to encourage people who are on, you know, EBTs or on SNAP programs to run into that door instead of looking for other options, then yeah, I think you do have a problem.
All right, James, I'm sorry. We're out of time for this segment. I could sit here and listen to this argument all day because it's really, really interesting. But unfortunately, we got to go to break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about the fun angle of food, sort of. We're going to talk about food stunts, the cinnamon challenge, the salt ice challenge, roast eating competitions. Do they make sense? Why do people do them? Stick around. We'll talk about that and more. Welcome back to The Point. In the last segment, we talked about the right way to feed people that are from poor backgrounds, poor families. But now we're going to talk about gluttony and basically using food for competition. Now, if you want an example of how our culture is devolving, I give you the cinnamon challenge, where people put a tablespoon of cinnamon in their mouths, and here's what happens.
I'm gonna do the cinnamon challenge because I got over 50 likes on my status. I think I got over 80. I guess you guys want me to like torture myself. I'm sorry.
All right, now I'm relatively young. Like, I like to think of myself as hip and edgy, right? I'm not hip and edgy at all, but I've never done anything like the cinnamon challenge. There's this other thing called the salt ice challenge, where people put salt on their skin and then they put an ice cube and literally burn themselves. I mean, it's ridiculous. And James, you know, out of all of our panelists, I feel like you'd be the only one who'd try something like this. So can you share your experiences?
Okay, so back in 2000, I did try the milk challenge, and you know, I made it about halfway through the quart of milk, and I was doing fine. I was looking at my watch. I was like, this is not going to be a problem. And then like 10 minutes later, I couldn't get off the floor, and I was sort of like rolling around slowly in agony. So what's wrong with people? I don't know. I mean, the guy drinking the Crystal Pepsi from 20 years ago video, that's a good one too. You should check that out. People like to suffer, and they like to take crazy risks, and they like to do so in a way that's entertaining for themselves and other people. And so on the one hand, this is like a pretty sad thing to watch. This is like a pretty low budget way of partying. On the other hand, it's still partying. It's still something that I think sort of shows us a little bit of what it means to be human, and I can't really hate on it.
You can't hate on it. Okay, that's cool. What are your thoughts, Willy?
Did you do milk or chocolate milk?
Regular milk.
Okay.
Whole milk.
What happened? Like, you just had a severe stomach ache?
Well, no, I mean, your body cannot actually like digest and metabolize whole milk at the rate that you would need to in order to finish the quart of milk within half an hour. So painful times.
So when I was a kid, thankfully pre-YouTube, we had a thing called the chocolate milk challenge, which I believe was a gallon of milk in an hour, and then you had to keep it down for a certain period of time. And the prize, and I grew up in a small town, and this like bounced around the whole kind of broader friend group, was a snowboard, which was really kind of a good incentive. And I totally tried the chocolate milk challenge, and there is a video probably somewhere in my parents' house of me throwing up lots and lots of chocolate milk in a public park. So again, very glad it was pre-YouTube. It's really easy to get really bored in a small town, and you will do really dumb shit to have a good time. And I know that doesn't sound like a good time, but then maybe your friends will do it, and you get to laugh at them.
It's kind of like, and it's also a great opportunity to entertain, as James mentioned. You know, it's a good opportunity to kind of be in with the crowd, to do something that might, you know, be perceived as you're kind of the center of attention while you're doing it, right? Now, Desi, as the only other woman on this panel, let me know what you think. Like, did you try?
I have to say, I hate these things.
You
like,
do?
To me, it's like the jackassification of America. You know, it's the idea that you turn this stuff into entertainment, and then now with YouTube, it's sort of gotten even worse now that it can be spread across all around the world. You know, but this is dangerous stuff. And granted, it's mostly teenage kids who are bored, and it's not going to have a problem. No one's going to get hurt by it, but there are people who will be, and I don't know that promoting this kind of stuff by making it seem like it's, oh, look how fun it is and it's not going to hurt you at all, but people actually do die from these things. Like you know,
the guy who did the cockroach
eating contest to win a python in Florida, and he choked to death and he died. You know, that's pretty bad, I think.
Well, to be fair, he could have choked to death eating anything else. It was, you know, right?
That's true.
Contests, though, some of the contests can be really kind of abusive. I mean, there was the woman who died holding her pee so that she could win a Wii for her son. And it's like two different kinds of like market activity when someone is like, maybe I'll become a star and I'll like make 50,000 bucks by eating cinnamon on YouTube, right? Sort of like different kind of risk calculus than like, I really, really want this product for my child because then my child will love me, so I'm going to like risk death and then die. Right?
That's just sad.
That's so depressing. But you know, another incredible part about this is, you know, the reason why these people do it and they post it on YouTube is because they will get a considerable amount of attention. Now, I did a vlog on the Salt Ice Challenge. I didn't actually do the Salt Ice Challenge, but Salt Ice Challenge was in my, you know, title. And that was the best performing vlog on my channel. And it's because people were like, oh, I want to see, is she going to do it? Is she going to do it? And people love that shit, which is why people will do it. They get the attention. You know what I mean? And I think that it can also extend to a broader discussion about people putting up like their fight videos on YouTube, because that also does really well and they get a lot of attention. But what kind of message does it send? Let me get to a serious point, sort of. Like, what kind of message does it send when we have like these hot dog eating contests where people are like shoveling massive amounts of food in their mouths, right? And it's just a perfect symbolic, you know, image of excess and gluttony, and then we have like these ridiculous conversations about whether or not we should feed the poor. I mean, does it mean anything about our culture? Does it say anything about our culture? James, I'll let you take that.
You know, I think what it says is that we've got a lot of potential energy here that's like really powerful and can be effectively, I hope, channeled into sort of more productive enterprises.
Yeah.
I look at a guy like Andrew WK, who has just partnered with Taco Bell. And this is like a guy who, you know, is famous for singing Party Till You Puke. And obviously Taco Bell is the kind of food that you would expect some people to choose to party until they puke with. But this is also a guy who's like a motivational speaker, and he's about like being fearless and about like looking at partying as something that's about more than just destroying yourself. It's also about sort of creating possibility in your life. Maybe it's too much to ask that, you know, hot dog eating contests could fuel sort of more productive activity among people, more like inspirational, creative, and positive activity, but I can't rule it out.
Have you guys seen that show, Man vs. Food?
Yes.
Okay, so Man vs. Food, it's hosted by this gentleman named Adam Richman on the Travel Channel, and basically he goes to various restaurants throughout the United States and he does these food challenges. Now sometimes he's eating something that's too spicy, but a lot of times what happens is he'll go to some Mexican restaurant that has like a burrito the size of this table. Yes, and he'll literally sit down and try to eat that burrito in a very short period of time, and that show does really well. And I think that, you know, maybe this might have something to do with like our fantasies of stuffing our face and not really facing any consequences for it, for being applauded for doing it, right? Because a lot of times you see the people on television, you know, wagging their finger like this and telling you, don't eat too much, you're eating too much, we're fat, our portions are too big, and then you see this dude, you know, eat without having to worry about it, and it kind of feels nice.
The all-American right to gluttony.
Yeah.
And to waste everything. Sure, why not?
Well, there's this place in Las Vegas called the Heart Attack Grill, and this isn't like an official like food competition, but like it kind of like has a similar philosophy, if you want to use that word. But two guys have died.
Yeah.
To eat there, and like we're like unofficial spokesmen. Like, I eat at the Heart Attack Grill. I'm 350 pounds. This is my thing. I love these burgers, and then they have heart attacks. And I think when like you get into something like that, where I guess the difference between like the dumb stuff I did when I was a kid is that we weren't trying to like get, well, more than kind of positive reinforcement from like a group of 5 or 10 people when that girl is like, well, I got 150 likes because I did this thing.
Yeah.
Like that's a little bit more problematic, and definitely like this idea of you know, advocating or promoting a place called the Heart Attack Grill because you're obese and eat there and then dying. I think that, you know, the hindsight after the fact for those guys would be, you know,
if they had a chance to
if
comment
they could
for
look back,
themselves about, hey, would you change
yeah.
what you were doing? You know, I think part of it is we're also amusing ourselves to death. That's the old book that was written many years ago about this idea that we are working so hard to entertain ourselves and to not have to think about these things. That's kind of, I think, where most of this comes from, is this idea that you can get rich quick, you know, something for nothing. I can win a food contest, a food challenge, and I can be famous now, and I didn't have to really do anything or work hard for it or go to school or be smart smart, you know, that we can amuse ourselves, literally in this case.
It could be used as a bit of a distraction. I mean, we are constantly looking for distractions. But one thing that I wanted to mention about the heart attack grill is I feel like it's the diet rebellion, right? Where it's like, you know what, I'm tired of this. I don't want to hear about BMIs anymore. So I love this place. They're going to make me fat, and they're being honest about it. And there's definitely a market for that honest advertising, right? Where they just tell you, like, this isn't good for you, it's really bad, you're probably gonna die, go ahead and eat it. And people will do it, it's incredible.
Well, I guess it kind of is similar to what you were saying about sustainability and kind of saying that you're compelled to take the fuck it approach. And is that we swing dramatically from one pole to the other? Like, really, you wanna hit it in the middle. Like, eat vegetables, have a steak. Like, you don't have to like just go all one way and be like drinking nothing but kale juice and basically being an aesthetic, and you don't have to eat at the heart attack grill and die.
Right.
You know.
Well, this also speaks in a way to the gamification of our culture too, where it's like, you know, even your trainer might say, look, like you have to eat right 6 days a week. On the 7th day,
go crazy.
F it, just you know, blow it out. And this is, I think, you know, this is something that you don't, this is a strategy you can take whether you're obese or not, super health conscious, not health conscious. And there's also something going on here too with masculinity. I mean, this is a thing that guys do.
That's a good point.
Guys make themselves suffer. Guys make each other do horribly embarrassing things. Competition. And when the alternative is like a guy going out and saying like, I'm going to start a fight, or I'm going to start a war, or I'm going to hit on this girl, and if I don't get my way, I might try to rape, you know, all kinds of horrible things men can do when they're frustrated and looking for entertainment and looking for a sense of power. And if, you know, risking a heart attack is one of them, on balance, you know, it could be worse.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. I mean, when you consider the hazing that fraternities do as opposed to sororities, I mean, fraternities are much more brutal, and it does have to do with masculinity and proving that you're a tough guy. So I can definitely see that aspect of these food challenges.
Well, and the salt ice thing is straight out of Fight Club, and I mean, that's kind of the whole thing, is like the society where men can be men and they can take out their anger. And, you know, there was, you know, kind of some very accurate foresight in that book and in that film of, you know, kind of where things could drift.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Well, feminists have like destroyed every opportunity for men to be men, so I'm glad that they're taking it out by doing salt ice challenges.
Yes, poor men, they just can't handle it. I don't know what it is. It's an interesting idea, though. This idea that it's rebellion, you know, rebelling against this idea of, you know, you have to eat this right thing, and this weird guy culture thing you guys have that, you know, you gotta make each other.
There's a larger population
too, right? It's catching on with the ladies, which is fine.
Oh, it's a huge turn on. Like, especially that milk challenge you did. I couldn't help myself. I was like, James, I gotta get your number.
Doing the cinnamon challenge? She was like 16, 17.
I know.
You know, then you get that bored teenager thing.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, unfortunately we're out of time, but I want to thank you guys for joining us. Desi, please tell our audience where they can learn more about you.
You can follow me on Twitter at Green News Report, and we get all of our reports at greennews.bradblog.com.
Willie, thank you so much for joining us for the first time. I hope you come back. Tell our audience more.
A lot of fun to be here. Thanks for having me. You can follow me on Twitter at Willy Blackmore, and you can read writing of mine and kind of similar issues, topics at takepart.com.
Sounds good. And James?
I'm James Poulos on Twitter, and go check out Huffpost Live, live.huffingtonpost.com.
Excellent. Thank you again for joining us. And you guys know who I am, Anna Kasparian. You guys can check me out Monday through Friday on the Young Turks and on Current TV. We'll see you next week with another great episode of The Point.